modules, and if I could just define them, I should go on eBay and see if I can find a pull out modules.
Okay, yeah, so let's get this underway. I think we're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Alex, and thank you all for coming to this panel as opposed to all of the other fantastic panels that are going on. And thanks to John for chairing this, and David and Louis for agreeing to work with it, and especially Louis for setting this up. So we'll just get right into it. I'm talking about the Royal Naval Air Service and winning of the submarine war, 1917-1918. And you'll have to bear with me for a little bit because there's some background material we got to go through, some operational details and all that, but we'll get into those nitty-gritty administrative aspects that I'm sure you all cannot wait to hear about. All right, so right off the bat. In 1914, the Royal Navy was not prepared for dealing with the submarine threat. The RN suffered a number of warship losses early on, such as the armored cruisers Cressy, Hogue, Abercur, pre-dreadnought Formidable, the light cruisers Pathfinder and Hawk, seaplane carrier Hermes, not to mention the new dreadnought battleship HMS Audacious, which was sunk by a mine, and all of these were lost to submarine and undersea warfare within the first 6 months of the war. Then, at the Dardanelles, the pre-dreadnoughts HMS Triumph and Majestic were sunk on 25 and 27 May, testifying not only to the reality of the danger, but also the Navy's unpreparedness for dealing with it. Now, on the other hand, Germany's overseas squadrons and merchant raiders had been quickly swept from the seas, detained or bottled up by blockade. Thus, from 1915 onwards, the submarine became Germany's primary merchant raider. As a result, Germany declared a war zone around Britain in February 1915, which produced several high-profile passenger liner sinkings, first the Lusitania in May, and then the Arabic in August. The loss of neutral and American lives, in outright violation of pre-war conventions, merchant ship seizure, prompted warnings from the United States government, which were enough of a threat to convince the German High Command to rein in the U-boats at least until 1916. So something clearly needed to be done. The submarine was a threat to both warships and merchants alike. At the Admiralty, First Lord Winston Churchill and First Sea Lord Sir John Fisher turned to the Air Department, which often took on the mantle of a kind of prototypical technological think tank. Fisher, who had established the top-secret anti-submarine committee in 1909, was convinced that aircraft would play a crucial role in countering the submarines. In October of that year, and then again in February 1915, Fisher insisted that the Air Department develop a system for hunting, attacking, and reporting on submarine contacts. This led to the development of the Sea Scout-type non-rigid airship, or blimp, which Fisher believed could act in the role of a submarine destroyer. Of course, he renders it in all capitals in his text, so little Fisherism there. In October of that, Fisher set to work with Edward Maitland, Captain Maitland, and Wing Commander Osborne, both airship specialists working for the Air Department's director, Commodore Murray Suter, to develop a stopgap program. Now, historians such as Hugh Popham and Alfred Price have since recognized that these blimps were, in fact, although ad hoc, effectively the precursor of the helicopter in the sense of their ability to loiter and detect and destroy submarines. Now, this is all and well. Technology, however, only represents one facet of the story. Another aspect of the utmost significance is the administrative situation and its evolution. This slide shows how the Air Department was organized until May 1915, with Suter as director and in direct control over all RNAS operations, reporting directly to Churchill. Now, after May 1915, when Fisher and Churchill resigned amidst the fallout from the Dardanelles crisis, they were replaced by former Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and the technocratic Admiral Sir Henry Jackson. So you have that on the next slide. So believe me, these are going to get a lot more complicated, so just bear with me. This slide indicates how the department was reformed. When Suter was replaced by Rear Admiral Vaughan and Lee as the new director of air services, Suter himself was sidelined to the position of superintendent for aircraft construction. They promoted him, I believe, they ranked him up to Commodore, but this was effectively a demotion for him. Now, in June 1915, Balfour rearranged the Air Department so that the wing captains and station commanders now reported not to the Air Department, but rather to the senior naval officers commanding the naval districts around Britain and in France. This meant that the method of central operational control favored by Churchill was abandoned, and the RNAS became highly decentralized, with the naval districts now possessing the authority to determine how the aircraft in their areas of responsibility should be employed. Now, the reason I'm lingering on this subject is because it becomes extremely important in 1917. So we're getting there. All right. So a little more background. Comes in. Yeah. Okay, so what was the merchant shipping situation during Balfour's tenure? This graph I took from Duncan Redford and Philip Gove's book on Royal Navy in the 20th century gives some idea of what was happening. As you can see, up to May 1916, the monthly loss rate for merchant ships never exceeded 200,000 tons, and the average was much lower. Unrestricted submarine warfare was curtailed in September 1915, then resumed in February 1916, but was again suspended following the torpedoing of the Sussex in March. And after that month, the submarines were recalled so that they could function alongside the High Seas Fleet. As the official historians Julian Corbett and Henry Newbolt observed, the Battle of Jutland that resulted on 31st May 1916 effectively closed the door on any chance of the High Seas Fleet breaking out to challenge the Royal Navy's blockade. So don't let anybody tell you that Germany won the Battle of Jutland. The result was that the advocates of unrestricted submarine warfare in Germany gained traction, and in February 1917, with the Kaiser's authorization, the U-boats were unleashed once again, this time regardless of the consequences. And this is what happened. Loss rates began to increase in October 1916, then skyrocketed to over 500,000 tons a month in February 1917, before peaking at nearly 900,000 tons in April, same month the United States declared war on Germany. Now, that figure is the highest monthly loss rate ever, so including the Second World War. The first convoys were introduced the following month, and shipping losses soon began to decline. However, as you can see, the losses remained above 300,000 tons for the rest of the war. Or much of the rest of the war, not enough to defeat the Allies, but not exactly a complete victory over the submarines. So in a sense, this is a containment situation. Now, another way to visualize this are these two maps, which are provided from Arthur Marder's books. And these suggest the concentration of losses, first in the English Channel, and then particularly in the western approaches, including off the coast of Ireland. Now, Ireland becomes extremely important later on, so I want you to really recognize the situation here. Now, particularly evident are the shipping lanes that the Admiralty established early in 1917. This was one of Jellicoe's initiatives, and he was wrong about this one. Although meant to provide patrolled routes for the merchant ships to follow, these lanes had the unfortunate result of exposing the merchant ships to submarine attack without the benefit of escort protection. It's a lot easier to find the merchant ships when you know exactly where they're going to be. And as you can see, the losses were significant. All right. So, in December 1916, the Asquith government finally collapsed, and David Lloyd George, formerly the Minister of Munitions, became the Prime Minister. Lloyd George immediately appointed Grand Fleet Commander John Jellicoe to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord, and Jellicoe, in one of his first acts, created the Anti-Submarine Division of the Naval Staff, appointing Rear Admiral Alexander Duff to head it. At the Air Department, Rear Admiral Vaughan and Lee was replaced by Commodore Godfrey Payne, who had previously been the director of the Central Flying School, and then RNAS Cranwell. He became not only the Director of Air Services, but also now the Fifth Sea Lord, responsible for all naval matters with a seat on the Admiralty Board. All right. In May 1917, Jellicoe reconstructed the staff with himself as First Sea Lord and now Chief of the Naval Staff, appointing Vice Admiral Henry Oliver, previously the Chief of Staff, as his deputy, promoting Rear Admiral Duff to an assistant position. While Oliver managed the operational side of the naval staff, Duff assumed responsibility for all anti-submarine components, and put in Captain W.W. Fisher to replace him as director of the anti-submarine division itself. So you can see that the Air Department is becoming increasingly integrated into the Navy, and this will become even more significant as we go forward. To improve control over the RNAS, this is really the money slide here, Jellicoe began to concentrate the RNAS wings and stations into groups, which could operate alongside the new regional district commands that he was establishing around Britain. Jellicoe has been criticized for delaying the implementation of convoys, and these organizational reforms help to explain why. Jellicoe was wary about forcing convoys upon the district commanders, preferring instead to let the regional heads sort policy as they saw fit. What this meant for the RNAS was that the new naval air groups were empowered to work with their regional naval counterparts to take whatever measures were necessary to curtail the submarine threat. And as John Abatillo has pointed out in his work, they take very different approaches, some of which we'll detail in just a moment. Only T.W. Ellison I couldn't find, so he gets the Facebook profile picture there. And I want you, of course, to recognize Vice Admiral Lewis Bailey here at Queenstown, we'll talk about this in just a minute, is working with Captain Hutch Cone, the United States Navy. So speaking of which, okay, the first example I want to look at is the case of Queenstown and Plymouth, where dramatically different approaches in command philosophy produced contrasting results. Now, an example of how significant personality is represented by the case of Admiral Bailey, who was known to be, quote, lukewarm about using seaplanes as he considered they would require support from his scarce surface assets, seeming to believe aircraft more of a hindrance than an asset. Bailey had, in fact, opposed an Admiralty proposal to build air stations on the south coast of Ireland as late as December 1916. Now, he starts working with Cone, I believe, in, it's like June or July 1917, but they don't actually get any stations built until, they start working on them in December, but they don't actually get them built until September 1918. So this gives you some idea of why we saw those loss figures at the shipping lanes earlier around Ireland. It's because they had no air assets to some extent. Though there were some airship bases built, but on a limited scale at the best. Yeah, Bailey favored sea route patrols for surface craft over aircraft altogether, although he changed his mind eventually when more reliable aircraft were introduced. Now, at Plymouth, on the other hand, Admiral Bethell was responsible for all shipping approaching England, and his air support was provided by Wing Captain Gerard, one of the first original naval aviators for the Royal Navy. Gerard commanded the Southwest Group. This group carried out patrols and escort missions along the coast, including the famous spiderweb type air patrols, which were implemented in 1917. You can see why they're called spiderweb patrols here. Of course, they originated at Felixstowe, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Gerard used his position to develop best practices, publishing a manual on airship convoy escort in September that year. It is significant that the development of his doctrine emerged from the interaction of the air group with the regional naval counterparts, and the practices were therefore tailored to the region, rather than being imposed hierarchically by the Admiralty. So there's kind of an organic element to the evolution of this doctrine, if you will. So, another example of regional anti-submarine development, and the significance of personality again, is provided by the case of the Dunkirk Command. RNAS Dunkirk was one of the most significant naval air stations during the entire war, as it was one of the few areas where enough resources existed for truly offensive operations to take place. Wing Captain Lamb, who reported to the SNO Dover, Vice Admiral Reginald Bacon, was a firm believer in bombing Germany's submarine bases in Belgium. Although the large cruiser-type U-boats stationed at Wilhelmshaven were out of range and therefore fairly well protected, the coastal submarines stationed along the Belgian coast were within operational range from RNAS Dunkirk. In November 1916, Vice Admiral Bacon authorized limited bombing of Ostend and Zeebrugge, and then added the base of Bruges to that target list in February 1917. There's like a long canal connecting Bruges to the ocean. By March, over 6 tons of bombs had been dropped on Ostend, Zeebrugge, Bruges, and the Ghent aerodrome when bombing was halted due to poor weather. Now, a major reorganization takes place in April, with the new DH-4 and powerful Handley Page aircraft arriving. However, operations were soon diverted by the pressing need for the RNAS to support the British Expeditionary Force and its operations, followed by the need to bomb the aerodromes from which the Gotha bombers were now beginning to attack England. So as you can see, there's a lot of integrated things happening here simultaneously. As such, the RNAS anti-submarine base bombing efforts were significantly diluted, a situation further exacerbated by Bacon's fixation on patrolling the Dover barrage and minefields, and conducting gunfire spotting missions against the Belgian coast. This was a favorite of his, and you can read about that at great length in his 2-volume Dover Patrol book. However, at the beginning of 1918, Admiral Bacon was replaced by Vice Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, who focused specifically on anti-submarine bombing and gave Wing Captain Lamb the authority to conduct an expanded base bombing campaign. Keyes also utilized RNAS support for his famous Zeebrugge and Ostend raids, which attempted to block off the submarine bases altogether in April 1918. So by the summer of 1918, submarine base bombing occurred on a daily basis, more or less, until in September, U.S. Naval Aviation Forces assumed responsibility for Dunkirk, carrying on Lamb's program of aggressive bombing. All right, so I think the last example we're doing here is Felixstowe. So while all of this was going on, the RNS had achieved some significant successes at sea. The introduction of North Sea patrols of the spiderweb type took advantage of the capabilities of the newly introduced Felixstowe flying boats developed by RNAS Felixstowe Wing Commander John Port, who had worked for the Curtiss Corporation on the America-type seaplanes before being attached to Commodore Reginald Tyrwhitt's Harwich Command. The new flying boats, with long-range endurance, heavy bomb capacity, and integrated wireless and signaling capabilities, achieved some dramatic successes in 1917. So, talk a little bit about that. To summarize, on 24 April, a submarine believed to be UB-39 was attacked by a flying boat with the assistance of a destroyer and was heavily damaged as a result. On 20 May, another flying boat successfully bombed a U-boat with 230-pound bombs, and the crew believed that they had destroyed a UC-36. Now, there's more cases, and I'll just skip over those. So one post-war source, Crow will be here all day, credited Port's flying boats with 13 submarine kills between 1917 and 1918. Now, although these dramatic successes indicate that the RNAS could make a real contribution to fighting the submarines, they were exceptional cases. Submarines were only rarely sighted during the thousands of hours of patrols flown, and U-boats could generally escape below the surface before a plane could line up a bombing run, unless they were caught by surprise. Suppressing the submarines by forcing them to submerge was nevertheless an effective way to reduce their potency, and even a bombing run that missed its target might cause enough damage to force the submarine to return to harbor, which was more or less the same as taking it out of commission for a short time anyway. Yes. And now we need to return to the administrative situation. So in August and September 1917, General Jan Smuts, another of the imperialists we'll be talking about, produced his report on the Gotha bombing raids and recommended the formation of a unified air force for countering Germany's air offensive. The result was that at the beginning of 1918, the Air Ministry was formed, and on 1st April, the Royal Air Force created. April Fool's Day, of course, at which point the RNAS and Air Department ceased to exist. Now, just to make add insult to injury, the Air Ministry moved into the Air Department's really nice offices at the Hotel Cecil, and the RNAS groups involved in anti-submarine warfare now became components of the the RAF. This always struck me as being kind of symbolic of the whole relationship, really. So, this is what the Air Department looked like in relation to the Admiralty late in 1917, with Godfrey Payne on the board and the RNAS groups tightly integrated with their naval counterparts. I want to stress that this is basically an entirely self-contained system. All right? And that's going to contrast quite a bit to the RAF situation. So the creation of the RAF was a watershed moment, obviously, but also represented a critical transformation for the Navy. The integration of the RNAS into the Navy, which had occurred over the preceding years, was completely upended, and the RAF now had to relearn what the RNAS had already discovered. To provide continuity following the removal of the Naval Air Squadrons from Admiralty control, the Air Division of the Naval Staff was created in January 1918. All right. So, the Air Division. This was one of Jellicoe's final acts as First Sea Lord before his replacement by Admiral Rosalind Wims. Headed by Wing Captain Francis R. Scarlett and Brigadier General Robert M. Groves, sequentially, the Air Division acted as a clearinghouse for operational research, technical developments, and in particular, the development of aerial anti-submarine warfare. Director Scarlett was concerned that the new RAF pilots did not have the training to conduct anti-submarine patrols and convoy escort missions, and so his department focused on the creation of training manuals to bring the RAF up to speed on what had been RNAS capabilities. In addition, Wing Commander Hugh Williamson, on the right there, was appointed, a very important figure, was appointed to command the air section of the anti-submarine division with the specific goal of distilling experience, conducting more or less operational research, and optimizing aircraft for anti-submarine missions. So this is what some of those manuals look like. This is just another, this is from Jellicoe's book on the crisis of the naval war, showing what the staff looked like in beginning of 1918. Right, so these are some of the publications that were produced by these various organizations. On the right is an example of Williamson's anti-submarine reports, the basis for operational research on aerial anti-submarine warfare. These are like monthly reports listing submarine attacks and counterattacks. In the middle is a guide for the Navy's airships providing tips on submarine hunting. And on the left is a post-war manual published by the Air Division, which summarized the lessons regarding aerial convoy escort. And there's many more. The Air Division staff files are immense, something like nearly 20 volumes at the National Archives, which I have photographed many. Right, so meanwhile, the anti-submarine conflict continued at sea. Group Captain Williamson was involved in a number of crucial developments that improved capability in 1918. In addition to Williamson's introduction of the anti-submarine reports, he helped to modernize the Admiralty's telephone exchange network, very significant, providing for rapid communication between air stations and the Navy's operational command. Submarine locations were identified and plotted by the naval staff, enabling rapid dispatch of flying boats and aircraft. A plot was also kept at the Felixstowe base, so information could be sent back and forth very quickly. The Blackburn Kangaroo, an anti-submarine bomber, was introduced in the spring of 1918 based on some of Williamson's reports. And this was the single most successful coastal patrol aircraft of the war. Despite only 17 being built by the armistice, Kangaroos sighted 12 submarines over 600 hours of flying between April and November 1918, or one sighting every 50 hours, which compares very favorably with one sighting per 196 hours for the large America flying boats. Historians have since pointed out that the Kangaroo was technically a superior aircraft to those that were in service with RAF Coastal Command in 1939. At least one submarine was actually destroyed by Kangaroo aircraft, UC-70, which was bombed by a Kangaroo equipped with 520-pound bombs, followed by depth charging by the destroyer HMS Oos. Another unique case in 1918 was the destruction of UB-115, which was located by the airship R-29 and then depth charged by patrolling destroyers. This is the actual photograph taken by R-29, which I think is pretty incredible. You can see them here attempting to depth charge, ultimately successfully depth charging UB-115. So, the resulting figures indicate that at least 8 U-boats and as many as 16 were destroyed. I have some of these figures here. Just give you some idea. Now, believe me, there's an unlimited amount of information regarding blockade figures, loss rates, and so on. I think the only important point really is this one. Only 5 ships were sunk which had surface as well as air escort. when they were in convoy. So, Germany produced 373 submarines of various types during the war, of which 145 were reported destroyed by British efforts. The total naval air contribution, British contribution that is, to the direct destruction of enemy submarines, therefore represented between 5 and 11% of total U-boats destroyed. Comparatively, only 30 U-boats were actually sunk by depth charging during the entire war. All of these successes, however, obscure somewhat the more mundane reality that the vast majority of the RNAS contribution was in the form of routine air patrols. By the end of March 1918, the Air Department estimated that only 7 to 20% of total sorties had been devoted directly to protecting merchant shipping through escort. In other words, the vast majority of what they're doing is simply collecting information by doing patrols and suppressing the U-boats in the process. So I have some conclusions for you. The RNAS anti-submarine system of late 1917 was a well-developed organization, tightly integrated into the Royal Navy, but at both at the administrative and operational levels. This was upended when the RAF was created on April 1st, 1918, because the RAF had other priorities, namely feeding machines and pilots into the battle on the Western Front, and had no experience in fighting anti-submarine warfare. Now, John Abatilos has pointed out that one advantage of the creation of the RAF was that it gave the Navy access to the RAF's very much larger training system. And this is a valid point. However, again, the same problem applies, which is that they didn't have any experience prior. They were focused indeed on other areas. The new aircraft introduced in 1917, along with the introduction of convoys, mass production of depth charges, Q ships, mine barrages, flying boats, airship patrols, hydrophone technology, American destroyers, all contributed to defeat the submarines. Convoys were the decisive component to which airships, kite balloons, and seaplane escorts acted as force multipliers. In this environment of unprecedented crisis and constantly shifting priorities and personalities, the undersecretaries and assistants were crucial as they provided a consistent stream of informed recommendations that the principals themselves could rely upon. At the Air Department, examples such as Commander Williamson, Captain Lamb, Wing Commander Port demonstrate that solutions did exist if the Admiralty was willing to listen. Wing Captain Scarlett and Captain Arthur Vivian were other such figures, and in the War Cabinet, Secretary Maurice Hankey, who introduced the paper that actually advocated for the adoption of convoys, was another such figure. Although the plethora of methods contributed synergistically to curtailing the submarine threat, it was ultimately the introduction of convoys which tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. It was realized that the arguments against convoys were basically spurious, and to the Admiralty's credit, they changed course within mere months. Now, intelligence gathering was an issue, but I think even more significant was the cultural context. The Edwardians believed, more or less, in meticulous control, and it required a leap of imagination, usually supplied by the RNAS officers themselves, and naval officers naturally, to surmount the realization that a war over the entire Atlantic and North Sea, not to mention the Mediterranean, which I haven't even begun to discuss here, could not be contained, and that the supposedly defensive concept of convoy was actually the only way to force submarines to attack escorted targets, thus providing opportunity for counterattack. So, final slide. You might be wondering, why did I drag you through this bureaucratic nightmare of administration and so on? Well, the answer to that question is really twofold. By 1939, the RAF, which had its own objectives and agenda, had managed to forget much of what had been learned through hard-fought experience during 1917-1918. As a result, the Admiralty had to rebuild Coastal Command essentially from scratch, when a prudent reading of history should have ensured that the Royal Navy was placed in a position to build off the successes of the previous 20 years, rather than starting all over again. Ironically, winning the submarine war in World War II meant rebuilding the system that had already existed in the First World War, and as you can see, the structure of the naval staff in 1947 certainly resembles what it had been earlier. And lastly, because, of course, we're in Annapolis, this was the beginning of American anti-submarine naval aviation, and you can see these two excellent photographs of the station that was built at Queenstown, and then the actual launching of an American A-16 flying boat late in 1918. And that is all she wrote. Thank you.
24 minutes.
Oh, timing it.
Our third presenter is Dr. David Conan. He's currently the director of the John B. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research at the U.S. Navy War College. In addition, he is currently serving as the officer in charge of the reserve facility supporting the executive programs at the National Intelligence University in Washington, D.C. He earned his doctorate with Andrew Lambert at King's College London.